Maybe you clicked out of curiosity. Or maybe, without realizing it, you were looking for a quiet corner, a place where words arrive slowly and even silence has a voice. I wrote this story with care, stitching together memories, hurt, and little discoveries, hoping that, at some point, you might see a piece of yourself in it. If that happens, even for a moment, stay, listen as long as you can. And if it touches you, leave a small sign, a like, a comment, maybe even share or subscribe. Sometimes, even a simple "I'm here" can mean everything. I was 12 the first time Rachel burned me. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was sitting on the carpet in my room, trying to finish a drawing for art class. My older sister, Rachel, waltzed in with Mom's iron in her hand, still plugged in, steam hissing from the tip. "Move," she said casually, like I was just furniture in her way. Before I could even react, the searing heat pressed against my shoulder blade. Shh. The sound of my own skin burning is something I'll never forget. Neither is the smell. I screamed so loud, the neighbors later told me they heard it through the walls. From the living room, Mom's voice drifted in, flat and cold. "Stop screaming like a stray cat and clean up before your dad gets home." No one came to check on me. Not Rachel, not Mom. The house fell silent again, except for the hum of the air conditioner and my choked sobs. I pressed a wet towel against the burn, shaking, realizing for the first time that in this house, I was truly on my own. That jagged, lightning-shaped scar under my shoulder blade became the first mark of a truth I wouldn't fully understand until years later. Love in my family was conditional, and I was failing the test. Growing up in that house felt like living in someone else's kingdom. Rachel was the golden girl, long blonde hair that caught the light, captain of the cheer squad, and somehow always smelling like strawberries and fresh laundry. She ruled with an effortless cruelty. If Rachel was having a bad day, I became the punching bag. Sometimes it was a shove against the wall. Other times, a whispered insult sharp enough to slice through my chest. And sometimes, like that first burn, it was worse. Mom never stepped in. If she noticed the bruises or the way I flinched when Rachel brushed past me, she pretended not to. Dad? He was a ghost in his own home, working late, coming back tired, never asking questions. His silence was its own kind of betrayal. Behind those walls, pain was normal. Screams dissolved into the carpet, and laughter, the rare kind, belonged to Rachel. No one would ever know, because we were the perfect family from the outside. Years later, when I was 19 and holding my newborn son Mason in the hospital, the smell of antiseptic and warm cotton stirred a memory I couldn't shake. That first burn, the hiss of my skin under the iron. I remember looking down at his tiny fingers curled around mine and feeling both wonder and terror. Would my home for him be any different than the one I grew up in? Would my silence turn into my mother's silence? I promised him then, softly, under the hum of the hospital lights, that the cycle would break with me. But promises are easier made in quiet rooms than kept in the real world. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon, the kind that smelled of reheated coffee and distant lawnmowers. I was folding laundry in the living room, half listening to Mason's toy cars rattling along the hallway walls, when a sharp thud cut through the air. Seconds later, Mason stumbled into the room. His face was flushed and wet with tears, a red mark swelling across his cheek. "Mommy," he hiccuped. "Aunt Rachel," she pushed me into the door. I froze. For a moment, I wasn't 23 years old in my own apartment. I was 12 again, the smell of scorched skin and carpet in my nose, the sound of my own sobbing echoing off those walls. I scooped him up, heart pounding. His little body trembled against mine. When I confronted Mom later, my voice trembled between fury and disbelief. "She shoved him, Mom. He's 4. 4!" Mom barely looked up from her phone. "He was making too much noise. Rachel's just trying to teach him how to behave." The words slid under my skin like ice. Teach him to behave. That's exactly what she had said about me once. My stomach turned. That night, after I tucked Mason into bed, I sat beside him in the dim glow of his nightlight. His tiny breaths rose and fell, his hand resting on my arm even in sleep, as if he knew I was ready to run. I couldn't stop my hands from shaking. I wasn't 12 anymore. I wasn't powerless. I whispered into the dark, more to myself than to him. It ends here. This cycle dies with me. But making a promise in the stillness of night and living it out under the weight of family history are two very different things. I'd spent years swallowing my fear, letting it rot quietly in my chest. But that night by Mason's bed had flipped a switch I couldn't turn off. A few days later, I got my chance. The house was tense as always. Mom in the kitchen scrolling through her tablet, Rachel tossing her cheer gear onto the couch like she owned the place. I picked a fight, small at first, asking why Mason wasn't welcome to play in the living room. Rachel snapped immediately. "Oh, please! That kid's loud and annoying, just like you were. What, you're gonna run off and cry again?" I held my phone low, thumb on the record button. My voice shook. "You can't just shove a 4-year-old into a door." Rachel laughed, a sound I had memorized from childhood. "I've been knocking sense into you since you were 12. Nobody cared then. Why should anyone care now?" Mom chuckled from the other room, as if it were some inside joke. I walked out before they could see the tears in my eyes. I didn't drive home. I drove to Ms. Carter's house, Mason's preschool teacher, and the only adult I truly trusted. When she opened the door, I barely made it to her kitchen table before the words spilled out. The audio played, Rachel's voice crisp and cruel in the quiet room. Ms. Carter's jaw tightened, and her hand hovered over mine. "This," she said, breath steady but full of heat. "This is abuse, and you don't have to fight it alone." Her calm was like a life raft. She nodded once. "Let me help you." In that moment, I felt something I hadn't in years, like maybe I wasn't trapped anymore. A week later, I was rinsing Mason's cereal bowl when red and blue lights washed over the blinds. My heart lurched, then froze as I saw the white SUV parked outside. Child Protective Services. It wasn't me who called. Ms. Carter stood on the curb, arms crossed, face set in that calm, unshakable way that says, "I'm done watching." The knock at the door was firm. "Ma'am, we're here to follow up on a report of potential child abuse," Mom answered, smiling too wide. Rachel hovered behind her, pale and twitchy. "This is a misunderstanding," Mom said, voice syrupy sweet. But Mason's bruises told their own story. Faint purple fingerprints on his arm, a small scrape on his cheek. One of the officers knelt to Mason's eye level. "Hi, buddy. Can you tell me who hurt you?" Mason hesitated, eyes flicking to me. Then he whispered, barely audible. "Aunt Rachel." Rachel gasped like he'd stabbed her. "Are you kidding me? He fell." The CPS officer's tone stayed professional, but the weight of it silenced the room. "We'll need to open an investigation. In the meantime, Emma and Mason will stay elsewhere for their safety." For the first time in my life, I walked out of that house with my head high, not hunched like prey. Mom sputtered something about betrayal. Rachel's voice chased me down the porch steps. "You can't just leave? This is your family." But Mason's small hand gripped mine, and for once, I felt like the cycle had cracked open. The first night in our tiny apartment was eerily quiet. No stomping footsteps, no slamming doors, no sharp voices slicing through the air. Just the hum of the fridge and Mason's soft breathing as he curled up next to me on the old pull-out couch. I'd traded a big suburban house for a cramped one-bedroom on the edge of town, but to me, it felt like freedom. The next few weeks blurred into a new rhythm. I picked up part-time work at a local daycare, where Mason could stay for free while I worked. In the evenings, I attended a community class on child development and basic trauma-informed care. I wanted to understand not just how to protect my son, but how to heal him and myself. Once a week, I sat in a warm office across from a therapist named Dr. Harlan. She didn't tell me what to feel. She just listened, and sometimes that was enough to unclench the knot I'd carried since I was 12. One day, After class, Ms. Carter, Mason's teacher, invited me to a local support group for survivors of domestic abuse. I hesitated at the door, my palms damp. I wasn't sure I belonged, but when I stepped in, the circle of women and men looked up and smiled in quiet understanding. No judgment, just knowing. When it was my turn to speak, my voice trembled. I grew up thinking silence kept me safe, but it didn't. It just made me invisible. I don't want to be invisible anymore. A gentle murmur of support rippled through the room. For the first time in my life, I felt something unshakable. I wasn't alone. Walking into the courthouse felt like walking into a storm I'd been avoiding my entire life. My palms were slick with sweat as I gripped my attorney's sleeve, while Mason sat in the lobby coloring quietly under the supervision of a CPS worker. The state had decided to move forward after the investigation. Emotional and physical abuse, endangerment of a child, and neglect. Inside the courtroom, Rachel lounged in her chair with that same smug tilt of her head I remembered from my childhood. When our eyes met, she smirked, like this was still just a family squabble she could win with charm and lies. My mother sat next to her, hands folded tightly in her lap, but her mouth was ready with rehearsed lines. "She's exaggerating," Mom said to the judge, her voice wavering with fake hurt. "Emma always wanted attention. She's only saying this to take the house and ruin our family's name." I said nothing. I didn't need to. My attorney pressed play on the recording I had hidden for years. Rachel's voice filled the silent courtroom. "That little weakling won't leave. I've been hitting her since she was 12, and nothing ever happened." Gasps rippled through the room. Even the judge's pen stilled mid-note. Then came the photographs, faded but clear. The jagged burn mark across my shoulder blade, the bruise on my arm from the stair railing. My childhood journal pages scribbled with shaky handwriting. "She hit me again. Mom said it's my fault." For the first time, Rachel's smirk faltered. I felt a strange, fragile power bloom in my chest. After years of silence, my truth finally had a voice, and it echoed louder than their lies. When the judge read the final verdict, I almost held my breath. Full custody of Mason was awarded to Emma Carter. Rachel Carter was banned from contact with both Emma and Mason for 5 years, with mandatory rehabilitation. The case was filed as a serious domestic violence case. The sound of a hammer being hammered rang out. It was a small sound, but to me, it sounded like chains falling to the floor. Rachel stood up abruptly, her face white. For the first time in her life, she didn't smile contemptuously. Mom sat motionless, her hands clenched around her purse, not saying a word. As I walked out of the courthouse, I could feel her eyes on me. A split, hazy mixture of pride and something like regret. I carried Mason to the car and held him close. The tears that fell were not from hatred. They were tears of a memory that had just been released. For the first time, I truly believed that the past no longer determined our future. 5 years passed, and Mason and I had settled back into our normal lives. Our small apartment was now a home filled with laughter, with Mason's paintings hanging all over the walls. I barely thought about Rachel anymore. Until one Friday afternoon, the phone rang. "Emma Carter?" the policeman said. "I'm calling to confirm. Rachel Carter has been arrested for child abuse at the summer camp she works at. We found a lot of evidence, and it will be in the papers soon." I fell silent, not from shock, but from a familiar chill. What I had endured now laid bare for the world to see. The next day, the news flooded social media. Former cheerleader arrested for child abuse, neighbors shocked to learn the truth. In the afternoon, my mother came to my door. She stood there, her eyes red, her hands shaking. "I was wrong. I thought that keeping quiet would keep the family together, but now, no one listens to me anymore." I looked at her, not angry, not gloating. Just turned towards the window, the late afternoon sunlight shining on the old scar under her shoulder blade. A painful story, now a mark of victory. Mason, now 10 years old, ran into the living room, holding a piece of colored paper. "Mom, I drew you a superhero shirt. Superman, Emma?" I laughed and held my son close. On the paper was a picture of a woman in a cloak, standing in the sunlight, holding a little boy's hand. There were no tears, no darkness, just simple happiness. My life has turned a whole new chapter. The scar on my back is no longer a mark of pain, but proof that I survived, fought, and won. That night, after Mason fell asleep, I opened my laptop and wrote a post to a forum for survivors of domestic violence. If you're hurting in your own home, remember, leaving isn't a betrayal. It's the only way you'll survive. And find a place where you'll be truly loved. I pressed the publish button, feeling like a final door in my heart closed. Outside, the rain had just stopped, and the afternoon light shone through the window, warm as Mason's arms.